The night Marmalade chose the cottage was the kind of night that made even the brave reconsider the meaning of warmth. Snow fell not in flakes but in silence, thick and deliberate, as if the sky were carefully tucking the world in. The road beyond the trees had long since disappeared, swallowed by drifts and shadow, and the wind moved through the hedges with a low, coaxing sound, like a voice trying to remember a lullaby. Marmalade felt it in his whiskers first, the cold that did not bite but waited. He had been many things in his life, watchful, quick, feral when necessary, but tonight he was simply tired. His paws ached. One ear bore a small tear from a winter long past, and his orange fur, usually proud and bright, lay dulled with frost and travel. Hunger sat low and heavy in his belly, not sharp anymore but resigned. He had learned the geography of winter well, which barns had doors that slammed, which porches offered only the illusion of shelter, which lights meant warmth and which meant shooing hands. Then he saw it. The cottage did not announce itself. It did not glow like a beacon or stand tall and confident. It simply was, nested between birch trees, roof bowed slightly under snow, windows fogged with lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, patient line, and the air around it smelled like burning wood and something else, bread perhaps or tea steeped too long. Marmalade stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath with him. A fence leaned nearby, old and softened by time, and beneath it the snow was thinner. He crept forward, every step a negotiation with the cold. The light from the window spilled onto the ground in a pale square, and in it he could see his own shadow, small, thin, and uncertain. Inside the cottage, Lara was humming. She didn't know she was doing it. It was the kind of hum that happened when the day had finally loosened its grip, a thread of sound, winding through the kitchen as she stirred a pot on the stove. Outside, the storm pressed close, but in here there was warmth layered upon warmth. Wool socks inside boots by the door, a kettle breathing quietly, rosemary drying in bundles along the beam. Lara lived alone, though she never quite thought of it that way. The cottage had its own presence after all. The walls creaked in familiar places. The clock on the mantel ticked slightly too loud. Even the chair by the fire seemed to wait for her, angled just so. She had just set the spoon down when she heard it. A sound so small it might have been imagined. She paused, listening. There it was again, a faint, questioning cry, half lost to the wind. Lara frowned, wiped her hands on a towel and crossed the room. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in like an uninvited memory, and with it came Marmalade, scooped by accident into the spill of warmth, eyes wide, tail puffed, unsure whether to flee or freeze. They stared at each other. Marmalade had seen humans before, of course. Tall ones, hurried ones, kind ones who left bowls and never returned. But Lara was different in a way he couldn't name. She smelled like soap and smoke, like ink and bread. Her eyes were soft but not searching. She knelt slowly as if the floor itself had asked her to. "Oh," she breathed, as if she'd been expecting him all along. Marmalade considered his options. There were fewer than usual. He took one step forward. The warmth reached him like a promise. Lara didn't move. She only held the door open a little wider, letting the light stretch out into the snow. Somewhere behind her, the fire popped gently and the kettle clicked off, forgotten. "Well," she said quietly, "you look like you've come a long way." Marmalade did not answer, but he crossed the threshold. Snow melted from his fur in tiny drops, darkening the wood beneath his paws. The door closed softly behind him, and the wind was suddenly a story happening far away. He stood very still, unsure whether the world might change its mind. Lara fetched a shallow bowl. She filled it with water first, always water first, and set it down a careful distance away. Marmalade watched, muscles coiled, every instinct alive and buzzing. When nothing terrible happened, he lowered his head and drank. The water was not frozen. That alone felt like magic. Later, how much later he could not tell, there was food, not much but enough. There was a folded blanket placed near the hearth, far enough away to be polite, close enough to matter. Lara spoke sometimes, softly, mostly to herself, about the snow, about how quiet the world had become, about how the cottage seemed bigger tonight. Marmalade slept with one eye open. But he slept. Dreams came, tentative at first. He dreamed of fields he didn't remember, of summers that smelled like dust and clover. He dreamed of being called by a name, though he could not hear it clearly yet. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, the snow kept falling, sealing the night shut. By morning, the storm had rearranged the world. The windows were rimmed with frost like lace, and the trees bowed under their white burdens. Lara woke early, as she always did, and for 1/2 second forgot. Then she saw him. Curled tight as a comma by the hearth, orange fur glowing in the low light, Marmalade slept as if he had been doing so his whole life. One paw twitched, chasing something in a dream. Lara sat on the floor without thinking. The cold seeped through her dress, but she didn't mind. She watched the steady rise and fall of his small body, the way his ear flicked at a sound only he could hear. "Well," she whispered again, smiling this time, "I suppose we'll have to figure each other out." Marmalade stirred. He opened one eye. And for the first time since winter began, he did not feel the need to run. Outside, the snow finally slowed, and the cottage, quiet, patient, and awake, held its breath, as if something important had only just begun. Morning arrived the way it often did in deep winter, not all at once, but gently, testing the edges of the world before committing. Light seeped through the curtains in pale ribbons, touching the floorboards first, then the legs of the table, then finally the hearth where Marmalade lay. The fire had dwindled to a low, companionable glow, embers breathing quietly beneath their ash. Somewhere far off, a branch released its burden of snow with a soft whump, as if the forest itself were stretching awake. Marmalade opened both eyes this time. For a moment panic flared, brief, bright, instinctive. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The smells were too many, too layered: wood smoke, tea leaves, wool, and beneath it all the faint, undeniable scent of human. He lifted his head. Nothing chased him, no door slammed, no voice rose in alarm. Lara was at the window, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her hair loose and slightly wild, as if sleep had only partially let her go. She held a mug in both hands and stared out at the snow-covered garden, her breath fogging the glass. She looked, Marmalade thought hazily, like someone who belonged to quiet places. He lowered his head again, but did not sleep. Instead, he watched. Lara moved slowly, deliberately, as though the morning were something fragile. She fed the fire, rinsed yesterday from the kettle, sliced bread with careful, even strokes. The knife made a soft, rhythmic sound against the board. Marmalade's ears tracked it automatically. When she finally turned and noticed his open eyes, she stopped. "Oh," she said, pleased in a way that felt contained, respectful. "Good morning." Marmalade did not respond, but his tail tip flicked once. Lara smiled as if that were answer enough. She set a small dish down near him, again, not too close, and filled it with something warm that smelled unmistakably like kindness. Marmalade hesitated only a moment before eating. Hunger still mattered, but it had softened overnight, dulled by the safety of walls and flame. As he ate, Lara sat at the table and wrote. The scratching of pen on paper wove itself into the cottage's morning sounds. Marmalade found it oddly comforting. Writing, he sensed, was something Lara did the way he listened, fully, with her whole body leaning slightly forward as if the act itself were a form of attention. Outside, the garden lay dormant beneath its quilt of snow. Raised beds slept. The old apple tree stood patient and bare, its branches black lines against the pale sky. Winter had stripped the world down to essentials, and the cottage seemed to understand this. Nothing here was extra. Everything had purpose or memory. When Marmalade finished eating, he did not retreat. Instead, he rose, stretched carefully, front paws long, back arching into a question mark, and took a few cautious steps around the room. Each place held its own temperature. Near the door, the floor was cool. By the hearth, warm enough to sink into. Beneath the table, shadowed and safe. Lara watched without stirring. She had learned, long ago, that watching too closely could be a kind of pressure. "Stay as long as you like," she said quietly, though she did not look at him when she said it. "There's no hurry today." Marmalade paused. Something in her voice, not the words, but the way they were offered, settled deep in his chest. He circled the blanket once, twice, then lay down again, this time on his side, exposing the softest part of himself to the firelight. Lara's pen stilled. She did not move toward him. She simply sat there, breathing, letting the moment be what it was. Time passed differently after that. The day unfolded in small rituals. Lara shoveled a path from the door, the crunch of snow sharp in the cold air. Marmalade watched from the window, his breath leaving faint marks on the glass. When she returned, cheeks pink and eyelashes dusted white, she laughed softly at his reflection beside hers. "Well," she murmured, "you make it look warmer in here." The sun climbed no higher than it needed to. Clouds drifted in lazy formations, reshaping the light again and again. Marmalade explored more boldly now, hopping onto the low windowsill, then the back of the chair by the fire. When Lara reached out, slowly, deliberately, he allowed her fingers to brush his fur. Just once. Her hand was warm, steady. She did not grab, did not linger. Marmalade withdrew, heart racing, but something else pulsed beneath the fear, curiosity perhaps, or the fragile beginning of trust. He groomed his paw carefully, pretending not to notice her small, knowing smile. As evening crept in, the cottage gathered itself again. Lamps were lit. Soup simmered. The wind rose outside, but it felt distant now, like a memory already losing its edge. Marmalade found himself listening, not for danger but for patterns. The tick of the clock, the sigh of the kettle, Lara's footsteps moving from room to room, always returning. And when night finally settled in, thick and blue and hushed, he did not go to the door. He chose the hearth instead. Outside, winter pressed close, patient and relentless. Inside, the cottage held its warmth carefully, as if aware that something fragile was learning how to stay. And Marmalade, curled once more in the firelight, dreamed again, this time not of running but of waiting, of mornings that repeated, of a name forming slowly, lovingly, just beyond the edge of sleep. The second night was quieter, not because less happened, but because Marmalade had begun to understand the language of the cottage. It spoke in warmth and repetition, in the steady way the fire was banked before bed, never rushed, never forgotten, in the soft click of the lamp as Lara turned it off, leaving only the firelight to finish the day, in the way the wind pressed against the walls but never through them, as if it, too, respected the boundary. Marmalade lay awake, long after Lara climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. He could hear her up there, the faint creak of the bed, the sigh she let out when she finally lay down, the slow rhythm of her breathing as sleep took hold. It was a sound he had learned to listen for on cold nights in other places, a sound that usually meant someone else belongs here. Tonight, it meant something different. The fire hummed softly, a living thing settling in for the long dark. Shadows stretched and shrank along the walls, turning beams into gentle ribs, corners into safe caves. Marmalade tucked his nose beneath his tail, then pulled it back out again, adjusting, negotiating comfort the way one does when it feels almost too good to trust. Outside, the snow began again. Not a storm this time, but a careful snowfall, each flake taking its time. The forest absorbed the sound until the night felt padded, wrapped in wool. Marmalade's ears twitched, but nothing stirred that needed chasing or fleeing from. Eventually, despite himself, he slept. When he woke, the fire was low, and the dark was deep. For a heartbeat, the old instinct rose, move, check, go, but it dissolved as quickly as it came. He stretched, crossed the room, and jumped lightly onto the chair by the window. The glass was cold beneath his paws, but the view beyond it was gentle. Moonlight on snow, the apple tree glowing faintly, the path Lara had shoveled already softened by drifting white. He sat there a long while, watching the night breathe. Morning returned again, as it had the day before and the day before that, because now there were days before that. Lara descended the stairs wrapped in a shawl, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder. She paused when she saw Marmalade in the chair, outlined by frost and early light. "Well," she said, smiling, "you look like you've always been there." Marmalade blinked slowly. Something loosened in his chest. The days that followed folded into one another like pages well read. Snow fell. Snow stopped. The sky cleared, then clouded again. Lara worked in small, purposeful ways, mending a tear in a sleeve, sorting dried beans into jars, writing at the table while Marmalade supervised from the chair opposite, tail draped just so. Sometimes she read aloud. Not for him, she would have said if asked, but her voice softened when she did, and Marmalade listened from wherever he happened to be. The words themselves mattered less than the cadence, the way they filled the room and left no sharp corners for silence to hide in. Marmalade grew bolder. He tested the stairs one afternoon, climbing halfway before deciding the height was a matter for another day. He discovered the warm pocket behind the bread box where heat gathered like a secret. He learned the precise moment Lara would reach down absent-mindedly to scratch behind his ears when she was thinking hard. And one evening, without quite meaning to, he answered her. She had been speaking softly as she stirred a pot, something about how winter always made time feel thicker, like honey left too long in the cold. Marmalade, curled near her feet, let out a small, questioning sound, half trill, half sigh. Lara froze. Slowly, as if the moment might spook itself, she turned. "Did you?" She stopped, then laughed under her breath. "Never mind." But Marmalade had felt it too, a thread drawn between them, fine and bright. The first real storm came a week later. Wind howled through the trees, rattling branches and hurling snow sideways against the windows. The cottage shuddered but held. Lara moved through the rooms lighting candles, their flames steady and golden against the blue dark. Marmalade followed her closely now, no longer pretending coincidence. When thunder rolled, rare and startling in winter, Marmalade startled despite himself. Before he could stop it, he leapt onto the chair where Lara sat, then climbed into her lap. They both went very still. Lara's hands hovered, uncertain, then settled lightly against his sides. Marmalade felt her heartbeat through her sweater, quick at first, then slowing. He tucked his head beneath her chin, breath warm against her throat. "It's all right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "We're here." The storm raged outside, but inside something ancient and careful took root. Marmalade purred, not loud, not triumphant, but low and steady, like a promise whispered over and over. After that, the cottage felt different. Not fuller, exactly, but aligned, as if everything had been waiting for its proper arrangement. Lara found herself setting an extra place of warmth without thinking. Marmalade found himself looking for her before sleeping, just to be sure. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the falling snow, between the fire's glow and the dark beyond the windows, the idea of home began to take on shape, slowly, gently, like frost-forming patterns on glass, each one appearing only after the last had settled just right. After the storm, the world felt newly made. Snowdrifts curved like quiet sculptures along the path, and the trees wore their white so heavily that they seemed to bow in gratitude. The sky cleared into a pale, endless blue, the kind that only winter dares to offer. Light poured through the cottage windows with a clarity that made every object feel intentional. The mug on the shelf, the stack of books by the chair, the single pinecone Lara had brought inside and forgotten on the table. Marmalade noticed everything now. He noticed how Lara paused each morning at the window, as if greeting the day before stepping into it. He noticed how she always warmed her hands by the fire before reaching for him. He noticed how the cottage creaked differently at night than it did during the day, and how none of those sounds meant danger. The days stretched unhurried. Sometimes Lara bundled herself up and went out into the woods, returning with cheeks flushed and pockets full of small discoveries. Fallen branches shaped just right, a feather, a stone smoothed by water and time. Marmalade waited for her, always near the door, pretending indifference but listening intently for the rhythm of her steps in the snow. When she came back, she always said the same thing. "I'm home." She said it even though she had never said it before he arrived. One afternoon, as the light faded early and the air took on that blue-gray hush, Lara sat on the floor sorting through an old wooden box. Marmalade watched from the hearth, eyes half-lidded, his body heavy with warmth. Inside the box were letters, tied with ribbon softened by age, dried flowers pressed between pages, a photograph or two, corners curled, faces caught mid-laugh. Lara handled each thing carefully, as though it might bruise. "I don't usually do this," she said, not looking at him, "but winter has a way of asking for it." Marmalade did not know what it was, but he understood the tone. He rose and padded over, settling beside her. His flank brushed her knee, light but certain. She smiled, absently stroking his fur. Later, when night closed in early and the moon rose full and bright, Marmalade found himself restless. He paced the cottage, window to door to hearth, something old stirring beneath his ribs. The moonlight tugged at him, silver and insistent. Lara noticed. "You hear something I do?" she asked softly. Marmalade paused at the window, tail flicking. Outside, an owl called, low and resonant, a sound that carried both solitude and belonging. Marmalade answered with a small, uncertain chirr, surprised by his own voice. Lara laughed quietly. "I suppose that's your cousin," she said. She opened the door just a crack, letting the cold slip in crisp and clean. Marmalade stood at the threshold, the world balanced perfectly between inside and out. Snow sparkled beneath the moon. The forest waited. He stepped forward, then stopped. Behind him the fire crackled. Lara stood close, not touching but present. The cottage breathed. Marmalade turned back. The door closed again, gently. That night he slept curled against Lara's side on the chair by the fire, the book forgotten in her lap. Her hand rested on his back, rising and falling with his breath. Outside, the owl called again, but the sound felt distant now, like a memory that no longer needed answering. Winter deepened. Snow piled high against the windows, turning them into glowing panels of light and shadow. Lara baked bread more often. The scent filled the cottage, rich and grounding. Marmalade learned the precise moment when the loaf would come out of the oven, and he positioned himself accordingly. They fell into a rhythm, so natural it felt as though it had always existed. Morning fires, quiet afternoons, evenings wrapped in lamplight and shared silence. Sometimes Lara spoke of things she had never said aloud before, not in full stories but in fragments offered gently, as if testing whether they were ready to exist outside her. Marmalade listened. He listened the way he always had, but now there was no edge to it, no need to plan escape routes, no hunger threading through the sound, only attention. One evening, as snow fell thick and slow once more, Lara finally gave him his name. She said it without ceremony, almost by accident, as he leapt gracefully onto the table and nearly knocked over her ink bottle. "Marmalade," she said, laughing, "you menace." The sound of it settled into him, like it had been waiting there all along. He answered her this time, a soft, certain sound, and the cottage seemed to lean in, listening. Outside, winter held firm, vast, and quiet. Inside, something continued to grow, slowly, patiently, like roots beneath frozen ground, preparing for a season that had not yet arrived. After his name was spoken, the world seemed to shift, just slightly, just enough to be felt rather than seen. Marmalade carried it with him as he moved through the cottage, testing how it fit. It felt warm, like a sunlit patch on a floor he hadn't known was there. When Lara said it again, softly, fondly, he felt something settle, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Winter continued its slow, deliberate work. Days shortened until the light arrived late and left early, lingering only long enough to paint the snow in pale gold before retreating again. Lara adapted without complaint. She lit lamps sooner. She kept the fire fed. She layered sweaters and scarves and moved through the cottage with the calm assurance of someone who understood the season's rules. Marmalade learned them too. He learned that afternoons were for sleep, deep, untroubled sleep that left his dreams gentle and blurred. He learned that evenings brought sound, the scrape of a chair, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of pages turning. He learned that night was not something to fear here, but something to rest within. Sometimes, when the wind rose sharply and rattled the shutters, Marmalade startled despite himself. Each time, Lara would pause whatever she was doing and speak, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, like an anchor dropped into rough water. "It's all right," she would say. "I've got it." And she did. One morning, after a night of heavy snowfall, the world outside lay so still it felt enchanted. The sky was a soft, pearled gray, and even the birds seemed reluctant to break the quiet. Lara bundled herself up and opened the door, letting the cold pour in like a held breath released. Marmalade followed her to the threshold. Snow had drifted high overnight, reshaping the familiar into something new. The path was gone. The garden was only suggestion and shadow. The apple tree stood half buried, its branches etched against the sky. Lara laughed, a sound bright and surprised. "Well," she said, "we're snowed in." Marmalade flicked his tail. The day took on a different shape after that. There were no errands to run, no distant obligations tugging at the edges of Lara's thoughts. The cottage became its own small world, complete and self-contained. Lara baked, read, wrote. Marmalade watched the snow fall, mesmerized by the way it filled the air, erasing edges, softening everything it touched. At midday, when the light was at its palest, Lara pulled out yarn and needles and settled into the chair by the fire. Marmalade leapt up beside her, kneading the thick wool blanket until it pleased him, then curling into a precise, satisfied loaf. "You're supervising," Lara said, amused. Marmalade closed one eye. The needles clicked together rhythmically, a sound as steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work. Inside, time stretched and folded in on itself, generous and unhurried. Later, Lara set a kettle on the stove and stood waiting for it to boil, hands resting on the counter, shoulders slumped slightly in a way Marmalade had come to recognize. He rose, padded over and brushed against her legs. She smiled down at him, surprise flickering across her face before softening into something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered, though he hadn't done anything he could name. That night the power flickered. Once, twice, then went out entirely. The cottage fell into sudden, complete darkness. Marmalade stiffened, heart racing. Darkness like this had always meant danger before, unknown spaces, unseen threats. He crouched low, ready to run, though there was nowhere to go. Then Lara spoke. "It's all right," she said calmly, "just the storm." She moved carefully, lighting candles one by one. Their flames bloomed into the darkness, turning it amber and alive. Shadows danced, but they were friendly ones, familiar and contained. Marmalade exhaled. They sat together by the fire, now the only true source of heat and light, wrapped in blankets. Lara told stories then, not to anyone in particular, not even to Marmalade exactly, but to the quiet itself. Stories of summers long past, of places she had lived before the cottage, of the day she first stepped inside these walls and felt, inexplicably, that she had arrived. Marmalade listened, head resting against her arm. Outside, the storm pressed close, wind and snow blurring the edges of the world. Inside, the cottage held firm, each candle flame a small declaration against the dark. When sleep finally came, it came gently. Marmalade dreamed of warmth layered upon warmth, of footsteps that always returned, of mornings that began the same way every time. He dreamed of the sound of his name spoken with certainty, as if it had always been his. And as winter deepened still, drawing tight around the cottage, sealing it into its quiet corner of the woods, something else deepened too, unseen but undeniable, like a promise forming slowly beneath the snow, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Winter did not loosen its grip, but it softened, just enough to allow the days to feel distinct again. There were mornings when the snow sparkled like ground glass beneath the sun, and others when the sky stayed low and heavy, pressing gently on the roof of the world. Marmalade began to recognize the subtle differences. He could tell what kind of day it would be by the quality of the light alone, by the way the air moved through the cracks around the window panes. On one such morning, the kind that felt hushed and waiting, Lara woke before dawn. Marmalade sensed it before he heard it, the shift in the room, the careful stillness of someone trying not to disturb a sleeping thing. He opened one eye and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed above the cottage floor, wrapped in her shawl, hands folded loosely in her lap. She wasn't sad exactly, but she was quiet in a way that carried weight. When she came downstairs, Marmalade followed at a respectful distance. The fire was already ash and memory, but she knelt to coax it back to life, breath fogging in the chill. Marmalade sat nearby, tail tucked close, watching the ritual unfold. Sparks flared, wood caught, warmth returned. Order restored. Lara made tea and stood at the window without drinking it, eyes tracing the familiar lines of the trees. Marmalade hopped onto the sill beside her, their reflections faint and overlapping in the glass. "You know," she said softly, "I never meant to stay this long." Marmalade's ear flicked. She smiled a little as if at herself, but here we are. The days that followed carried a thoughtful air. Lara wrote more, her pen moving with purpose, her pauses longer. Marmalade sensed it and stayed close, curling against her side, anchoring her to the moment whenever her gaze drifted too far. Once, while she was lost in thought, Marmalade leapt onto the table and sat directly on her papers. She laughed then, full and bright, and the sound seemed to shake something loose. "All right," she said, lifting him gently. "Point taken." Snow fell again, lighter this time, as if the season itself were growing tired. The paths Lara shoveled no longer disappeared entirely overnight. Birds returned in cautious pairs, leaving delicate marks across the white. Marmalade watched them intently. Something stirred in him, not restlessness but awareness. The world was shifting slowly, the way it always did. He felt it in the air, in the longer slant of the afternoon light, in the way the cottage seemed to inhale a little deeper each day. One evening, Lara opened a cupboard Marmalade had never seen before. Inside was a small, worn collar. She held it for a long moment, thumb brushing the leather absent-mindedly. Marmalade watched from the chair, curious but unafraid. "I found this ages ago," she murmured. "Never knew why I kept it." She didn't put it on him. She didn't even move toward him. She simply set it back on the shelf and closed the door, as if acknowledging that some things could wait. That night Marmalade dreamed of doors, not closing ones but open ones. Doorways filled with light, thresholds that didn't demand urgency. In the days that followed, he grew braver still. He ventured onto the porch while Lara chopped wood, sat beside her boots when she came in cold and tired, even followed her partway into the snow before deciding that watching was adventure enough. And always, he came back inside first. One afternoon, as dusk crept in slow and blue, Lara knelt to refill his bowl. Marmalade brushed past her, tail high, and for a fleeting moment she rested her forehead against his side. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. Marmalade purred, deep and steady. Outside, winter lingered at the edges of the world, reluctant to leave. Inside the cottage, warmth gathered patiently, layered with memory and quiet understanding. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the soft fall of snow, between the life Marmalade had known and the one unfolding now, something continued to grow, unfinished, unhurried, and very much alive. The cottage learned new habits without ever announcing them. A second mug now lived by the sink, though only one pair of hands ever lifted it. A chair was always left slightly pulled out from the table, just enough for a cat to jump up without ceremony. The blanket by the fire bore the faintest orange threads, woven in slowly, incidentally, as Marmalade turned and turned until the spot was just right. Marmalade noticed these things in the way animals do, not as changes, but as truths revealing themselves. One afternoon, when the snow had softened into something more like memory than obstacle, Lara opened the front door and let the cold linger. She stood there longer than usual, coat already on, scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Marmalade sat behind her, watching the world beyond the threshold. "I won't be long," she said, glancing down at him. "Just the post." He followed her anyway. The porch creaked beneath his paws, the sound sharp and unfamiliar. The cold reached for him immediately, nosing at his fur, reminding him of all the winters before this one. He hesitated, ears flicking, but Lara was right there, boots crunching, breath puffing into the air. "You don't have to," she said gently. Marmalade took another step. The snow was deeper than he expected. It swallowed his paws, clung cold and insistent. He lifted them high, indignant but determined, following the narrow path Lara had carved earlier that morning. The world outside felt enormous. Trees loomed taller than memory. The sky stretched endlessly overhead. Every sound carried his own breathing, the faint rustle of something small beneath the snow, the distant creak of ice shifting somewhere far away. He made it only a few steps before stopping. That was enough. Lara noticed immediately. She knelt in the snow, uncaring of the cold soaking into her knees, and held out her hand. Marmalade considered it, then leaned forward, brushing his cheek against her fingers. She smiled. "Brave enough," she said. They went back inside together. That evening, Lara received a letter. Marmalade knew it was different before she opened it. He could hear it in the way the paper crackled, sharper than usual, in the way her shoulders tensed just slightly as she read. She sat very still at the table, letter unfolded, eyes moving but not quite seeing. Marmalade jumped up beside her and lay down squarely on the page. She startled, then laughed, softly, shakily. "Right," she said, folding the letter away. "Later." She didn't read it again that night. Instead, she made soup thick with vegetables and herbs, the kind that required time and attention. Marmalade supervised from his chair, eyes following each movement. The familiar sounds of chopping and stirring returned, grounding the evening. Later still, Lara sat by the fire and mended a tear in one of her sweaters. Marmalade lay stretched beside her, belly up, utterly unguarded. Every so often, her foot brushed his side, and he responded with a lazy flick of his tail. The letter waited on the table, silent and patient. Days passed. The light changed again, almost imperceptibly at first, but Marmalade felt it. The sun lingered a little longer in the afternoons. Icicles dripped steadily from the eaves, their slow rhythm marking time. Somewhere beneath the snow, water began to move. Lara noticed too. She began opening the curtains wider. She carried her mug outside sometimes and stood on the porch, face tilted toward the weak but persistent sun. Marmalade watched from the doorway, content to remain half in shadow, half in light. One afternoon, Lara brought home a small wooden box from the shed. She set it on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were seeds. She sorted through them slowly: beans, squash, herbs whose names Marmalade did not know. She lined them up in neat little rows, hands moving with quiet reverence. "Soon," she murmured. Marmalade jumped onto the table and sniffed the packets. They smelled like paper and promise. That night the wind was gentle, almost kind. The fire burned low and steady. Lara read aloud again, her voice weaving through the room. Marmalade drifted in and out of sleep, the words wrapping around him even when they no longer made sense. Outside, winter still ruled, but it no longer felt endless. Inside the cottage, warmth gathered in layers, memory upon memory, choice upon choice. Marmalade shifted closer to the fire, closer to Lara, closer to the life that was forming so quietly it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way it felt, solid, patient, and still unfolding. Late winter had a different sound. It was quieter than deep winter, but not in the same way. The silence no longer felt sealed. It felt porous, as though something were listening from beneath it. Snow still lay thick in places, but it had begun to settle into itself, shrinking at the edges, revealing dark seams of earth and bark and stone. Marmalade heard the change before he understood it. Drops fell from the eaves in slow, deliberate intervals, tick, 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 each one landing with a soft, almost apologetic sound. The rhythm fascinated him. He sat on the windowsill for long stretches, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, eyes tracking each fall as if it were a message written in water. Lara noticed, of course. "That's the sound of things moving again," she said one afternoon, joining him at the window. "It always starts quietly." Marmalade flicked an ear, but did not look away. The cottage responded to the change with small adjustments. Windows were cracked open for a few minutes each day, letting in air that smelled faintly of damp earth instead of ice. Lara shook out rugs and set them back down in new places. She moved more, stretching her arms in the mornings, lingering less by the fire. Marmalade adapted with her. He slept a little lighter now, waking more often to watch the play of shadows across the walls. His dreams shifted too, still warm, still safe, but threaded with motion. Paths, breezes, the suggestion of something just beyond the next bend. One afternoon, while Lara was writing, Marmalade hopped onto the table and settled directly between her arms. This had become a habit, an arrangement neither of them commented on anymore. She paused, pen hovering. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I used to think staying meant giving something up." Marmalade blinked slowly. "But now," she continued, scratching absently behind his ear, "I think it just means choosing what you grow." Her pen moved again. Outside, a bird sang, brief, experimental, as if unsure it was allowed. Marmalade's ears swiveled sharply. He lifted his head, listening, heart thudding with something that was not fear. He did not move toward the door. That evening, Lara brought the wooden box of seeds back inside. She spread them out again, this time with more intention. Marmalade supervised from the chair, chin resting on the edge of the table. "I'll need help," she told him, "keeping watch, making sure nothing gets dug up." Marmalade's tail tip twitched. The days lengthened by inches. The light at dusk turned lavender instead of blue. Snow receded from the base of the apple tree, revealing rough bark and the promise of roots drinking again. One night the fire went out on its own. Not suddenly, just gently, as if it had done enough for the season. Lara noticed but didn't rush to fix it. She wrapped herself in a blanket instead and sat listening to the quiet. Marmalade curled beside her, pressed close, sharing warmth without flame. Outside, the forest breathed. The letter still sat in the drawer. Sometimes Lara opened it and stared at it without unfolding it. Other times she forgot it entirely, absorbed in the small, necessary acts of living, washing dishes, sweeping ash, setting bowls down in familiar places. Marmalade sensed the letter's presence the way he sensed weather, not as a threat, but as a change waiting its turn. One morning he followed Lara farther into the snow than he ever had before. The ground was uneven, slick with meltwater, and he moved carefully, placing each paw with intention. Lara laughed softly, slowing her pace to match his. "You don't have to keep up," she said. But he did. They reached the edge of the garden where snow thinned and patches of dark soil peeked through. Marmalade sniffed the ground, whiskers brushing damp earth. The smell startled him, rich, alive, undeniable. He sneezed. Lara laughed outright then, the sound ringing clear in the open air. When they returned inside, Marmalade shook himself vigorously, scattering droplets across the floor. Lara didn't scold. She only fetched a towel and dried his paws one by one with careful hands. That night Marmalade dreamed of green, not vivid, not yet, but hinted at, of softness underfoot, of warmth that came from above rather than below. He woke before dawn, alert and restless. The cottage was still. Lara slept upstairs. Outside, something shifted beneath the quiet, subtle, persistent, unstoppable. Marmalade rose and went to the window. The snow continued to melt, drop by drop, carrying winter away piece by piece. And as he watched, wrapped in the familiar glow of the cottage, Marmalade felt it clearly now. The sense that this was not an ending but a crossing, slow, gentle, unfinished, into whatever came next. The morning that followed felt different enough that Marmalade noticed it before his eyes were fully open. The air had changed. It was no longer sharp at the edges, no longer something to brace against. It moved through the cottage softly, almost shyly, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood and thawing earth. Marmalade lay still on the blanket by the hearth, whiskers twitching, breathing it in as though committing it to memory. Somewhere upstairs, Lara stirred. Her footsteps came more lightly now, no longer cautious of the cold floors. She paused halfway down the stairs, listening, as if the house itself had spoken to her. When she reached the bottom, she went straight to the window and opened it wider than usual. Cool air slipped inside, not unwelcome. "Well," she murmured, smiling to herself, "there you are." Marmalade rose and joined her, leaping onto the sill with practiced ease. Outside, the world looked washed and quiet. Snow lingered in shaded places, but the ground showed through in others dark, uneven, alive. Water trickled along a shallow groove near the path, finding its way downhill with patient certainty. A breeze stirred the branches. Marmalade's ears flicked forward. The sound carried information now, not warning. He leaned forward slightly, curiosity outweighing caution. Behind him, Lara wrapped her arms around herself and leaned close, not touching him, but near enough that he felt the warmth of her presence. "It always feels like the world is holding its breath right about now," she said, "like it's waiting to see what we'll do." Marmalade did not know what we meant in that sentence, but he liked the sound of it. The day unfolded slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the moment. Lara cleaned out the hearth, scooping ash into a small metal bucket. Marmalade supervised, sitting primly out of reach, eyes following each movement. When she finished, she left the fire unlit. Sunlight streamed in instead, pooling on the floor where Marmalade promptly relocated himself. It was a different kind of warmth, lighter, more playful. He rolled onto his back, paws lifted slightly, belly exposed to the glow. Dust motes danced above him, turning lazily in the air. Lara laughed when she saw him. "Already adjusted, I see." Later, she carried the wooden box of seeds outside and set it on the porch. Marmalade followed, stopping just short of the edge, content to observe from safety. Lara knelt and brushed snow away from a small patch of earth, her movements slow and reverent. "Not yet," she said, mostly to herself, "but soon." Marmalade watched her hands press gently into the soil, fingers testing its give. Something about the motion tugged at him. He stepped forward, placing one paw onto the bare ground. It was cold, but not hostile. He withdrew the paw immediately and licked it, affronted, but he did not retreat back inside. Instead, he sat right there on the threshold, half in, half out, as if holding the space open. That night, Lara cooked with the windows cracked. The sounds of the forest slipped in: distant water, a bird calling once and then again, the hush of wind moving freely between trees. Marmalade ate his dinner and then wandered the cottage restlessly, as though checking that everything was still where it belonged. The letter came out again. Lara held it while standing by the table, turning it over once, then twice. Marmalade jumped up beside her and sniffed the corner, unimpressed. She smiled. "I know," she said quietly, "not tonight." She placed it back in the drawer, and closed it with deliberate care. As darkness fell, it did so more gently than before. The lamps came on later. The shadows felt thinner. Marmalade curled on the chair while Lara read, but he did not sleep right away. He watched the room, the door, the windows, alert not from fear but from awareness. Something was changing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way snow receded inch by inch, in the way Lara hummed while washing dishes now, in the way Marmalade no longer startled at unfamiliar sounds but leaned toward them instead. Outside, winter loosened its hold but did not yet leave. Inside the cottage, warmth and patience held steady, making room without rushing. And Marmalade, named, fed, warm, rested in that space between what had been and what was still becoming, knowing only this, that whatever came next, it would arrive slowly, and he would be here to meet it. The first rain of the season arrived quietly. Not with thunder or announcement, but with a soft tapping against the window panes, so gentle that Marmalade mistook it at first for another dream. He lay stretched along the back of the chair, one paw dangling, eyes half-lidded. The sound threaded its way into his awareness slowly, tap, 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 irregular, curious, alive. He lifted his head. Outside, the snow was melting in earnest now, giving way to darkened earth and slick stones. Rain slid down the glass in thin, wandering lines, blurring the forest into watercolor shapes. The smell that followed was unmistakable and new. Wet soil, bark, something green waiting just beneath the surface. Marmalade chirred softly. Lara looked up from where she sat at the table, a stack of folded linens beside her. "You hear it too," she said, smiling. She stood and opened the window just a crack. Cool, damp air slipped inside, carrying the rain's quiet conversation with it. Marmalade leaned forward eagerly, whiskers brushing the glass, nose twitching as he tried to make sense of it all. "This is my favorite," Lara murmured, "the part where winter finally lets go." The rain lasted all afternoon. It drummed lightly on the roof, traced the edges of the porch, coaxed steam from the ground. Lara moved through the cottage slowly as though honoring the mood. She brewed tea and let it steep longer than usual. She rearranged the bookshelf, pausing to reread the first lines of old favorites. Marmalade followed her from room to room, a constant orange presence, occasionally stopping to sit very still and listen. When evening came, the rain softened further, becoming a whisper. Lara lit a single lamp and left the rest of the cottage dim. Shadows gathered but did not threaten. Marmalade curled on the rug, his body warm and heavy, purr rumbling faintly as the sound of rain wrapped the cottage in a cocoon. Later, Lara knelt and pressed her forehead briefly to the floor beside him. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. Marmalade shifted closer, resting his chin against her wrist. The days after the rain felt looser somehow, as if the world had exhaled. Patches of grass appeared where snow had lingered stubbornly. Tiny rivulets formed and vanished overnight. The forest smelled different every morning, sometimes sharp and bright, sometimes deep and loamy. Marmalade began spending more time by the door. Not scratching, not asking, just watching. Lara noticed but didn't comment. She simply left the door open longer when the weather allowed, letting the boundary between inside and outside blur just a little. Marmalade sat at the threshold, sunlight warming his back, shadow cooling his paws. One afternoon, Lara carried the seed box into the garden. Marmalade followed this time, without hesitation. The ground was damp and uneven, but he navigated it carefully, stepping where she stepped, stopping when she stopped. Lara knelt and began turning the soil in one of the raised beds, dark earth folding over itself like fabric. Marmalade watched, transfixed. A worm surfaced briefly, then vanished again. He leaned forward, eyes wide, instincts humming, but he did not pounce. Instead, he sat back, absorbing the movement, the smell, the quiet urgency of things waking up. "That's enough adventure for today," Lara said gently, noticing his focused stillness. They returned inside together, leaving muddy footprints and damp paws in their wake. Lara laughed as she cleaned them up, towel in hand, patience endless. That night the cottage felt especially full. Not crowded, but held, as though the walls had learned something new and were keeping it safe. Marmalade slept deeply, curled into the curve of Lara's legs as she rested on the chair, the book once again forgotten in her lap. He dreamed of open spaces that did not frighten him, of doors that stayed open without demanding anything, of warmth that followed, not chased. Outside, rainclouds drifted away, leaving the sky pale and rinsed. Inside, the fire was not lit, but it was not missed. Something was unfolding, gently, inevitably. And Marmalade, who had once belonged only to the moving edges of the world, slept on, content in the quiet center of it, unaware of how close he was to discovering that some journeys do not lead away at all, but deeper into what has already begun. The rain left behind a softness that lingered for days. Not just in the ground, though the earth darkened and loosened beneath Lara's boots, but in the way the cottage seemed to listen more closely, as if it had learned a new kind of patience. The walls no longer creaked in protest when the wind shifted. Instead, they settled, adjusted, accepted. Marmalade felt it too. He moved through the rooms with an ease that would have surprised the cat he once was. His steps were quieter now, not from caution but from familiarity. He knew which floorboards sang and which stayed silent. He knew where the afternoon sun fell strongest and which corners cooled first as evening arrived. One morning, he woke before Lara and did not immediately look for her. This startled him. He lay still on the rug, listening to the gentle drip of water from the eaves, to the faraway sound of something small moving through undergrowth. He felt no urgency, no need to check or flee, only awareness, calm and steady. Eventually, he rose and padded upstairs. The loft was filled with early light, pale and forgiving. Lara slept on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other resting open on the blanket. Marmalade jumped up beside her and sat, watching her breathe. After a while, he lay down too. She woke slowly, smiling before her eyes were even open. "Well," she murmured, voice rough with sleep, "good morning to you too." Marmalade answered with a quiet trill and pressed his forehead against her chin. Lara laughed softly and pulled the blanket up around them both, lingering in the moment longer than usual. The day took its time beginning. Breakfast was simple. The windows stayed open. A breeze wandered through the cottage, rearranging curtains and carrying in the distant sound of water moving over stone. Marmalade chased the shifting light across the floor, pouncing half-heartedly at dust motes that dared to dance. Later, Lara brought out a broom and swept the porch. Marmalade watched from the doorway, ears perked. Each stroke of the broom revealed more of the wood beneath, weathered, sturdy, unchanged. The smell of wet pine and old boards filled the air. "You're inspecting," Lara said, amused. Marmalade stepped out onto the porch and sat in a patch of sun, back straight, tail curled neatly around his paws. He blinked slowly at her, a deliberate, generous gesture. The afternoon brought clouds again, but not the heavy ones. These drifted lazily, casting moving shadows across the clearing. Lara spent time in the garden, pressing seeds into the soil at last. Marmalade sat nearby, alert and watchful, occasionally batting at a twig or watching an ant with grave concentration. Nothing rushed them. As evening approached, Lara washed her hands at the sink, mud streaking away in pale ribbons. Marmalade jumped onto the counter, sniffing her fingers. "Soon," she said again, though this time she sounded certain. "Everything in its own time." That night the forest came alive with new sounds. Frogs called from somewhere unseen. Insects hummed experimentally. Marmalade sat by the open window, ears swiveling, body taut with interest. He did not bolt. He did not hide. He listened. Lara joined him, setting a blanket around their shoulders like a shared secret. "They're waking up," she said. "All of them." Marmalade's tail flicked slowly, thoughtfully. When sleep came, it came in pieces. He woke once to the sound of rain again, lighter this time, brief and passing. He woke again to moonlight slipping across the floor, bright enough to draw shadows sharp and clear. Each time the cottage was the same. Warm, quiet, steady. Near dawn, Marmalade dreamed. He dreamed of walking, not fleeing, not wandering, but choosing. Of following a familiar scent through tall grass. Of turning back without fear. Of a place that did not close behind him when he entered but waited. When he woke, the light was just beginning to return. The world outside was changing, slowly but undeniably. Inside the cottage, Lara slept peacefully, one hand resting where he would soon curl back into place. Marmalade rose, stretched, and stood for a long moment in the half-light, poised between movement and rest. And then, unhurried, unafraid, he lay back down, settling into the warmth that had learned his shape, as the season turned quietly onward. Spring did not arrive all at once. It wandered in. It came first as a hesitation in the air, a softness that brushed past and then retreated, as if unsure it would be welcome. Marmalade sensed it in the way the morning smelled faintly of green, even before anything green could be seen. He sensed it in the way the birds argued more loudly at dawn, in the way the forest no longer slept as deeply. One morning, mist gathered low around the cottage, turning the world into a pale suggestion. Marmalade sat at the window, watching trees dissolve and reappear as the light shifted. The glass was cool beneath his nose, but not cold. Not anymore. Lara moved quietly behind him, careful not to disturb the spell. She set a kettle on the stove and stood waiting for it, hands wrapped in her sleeves, gaze unfocused. Marmalade could tell she was thinking, not urgently, not heavily, but with the kind of attention one gives to something that is still deciding what it wants to be. When the kettle began to sing, she startled slightly, then smiled at herself. "Always forget that part," she said. Marmalade hopped down from the sill and followed her as she poured the water, steam blooming upward like a sigh. He circled her ankles once, then settled nearby, close enough to feel the warmth but not demanding it. They drank and waited. The mist lifted slowly, revealing the garden in pieces. First the apple tree, then the raised beds, then the narrow path winding away into the woods. Sunlight filtered through, thin and tentative. Later that day, Lara opened the door wide and left it that way. Marmalade noticed immediately. Air moved freely now, carrying in the layered sense of outside. Wet bark, last year's leaves, something faintly floral but not yet named. He stood just inside the threshold, body angled forward, every sense alert. "You can go out," Lara said gently, not looking at him. Marmalade considered this. He stepped onto the porch, paused, then took another step. The wood was dry and warm underfoot. He sat, surveying the clearing as if seeing it for the first time. Nothing rushed him. Nothing chased him. Behind him, the door remained open. The days took on a new rhythm after that. Marmalade spent his mornings drifting between inside and out, sunning himself on the porch, then returning to nap near the window. Lara worked in the garden more often now, hands dark with soil, hair escaping its braid. She spoke to the plants as she worked, not in full sentences, but in murmurs of encouragement and apology. Marmalade watched, tail flicking thoughtfully. Once a breeze startled him, carrying a sudden flurry of leaves across the clearing. His body tensed, muscles remembering old instincts. But the moment passed, the leaves settled, the world remained kind. That evening, Lara brought the letter out again. She sat at the table with it unopened, turning it over slowly. Marmalade jumped up and pressed his paw against it, pinning it in place. She laughed softly. "You don't trust it, do you?" Marmalade did not move his paw. "All right," she said, "not tonight." She slid it back into the drawer, and this time she lingered there a moment longer, hand resting on the wood as if acknowledging something unsaid. Night fell gently. The forest hummed with life now, soft, layered sounds that wove together into something almost musical. Marmalade lay on the rug, eyes half closed, listening. Lara read by lamplight, her voice low and steady. At some point, she stopped reading and simply sat there, watching the shadows move. "I think," she said quietly, "this is the longest I've ever stayed anywhere." Marmalade opened one eye. "And I think," she continued, reaching down to rest her hand on his back, "it's because it finally feels like I don't have to decide anything all at once." Marmalade purred, deep and even. Outside, the stars emerged, brighter than they had been all winter. Inside, the cottage held its warmth, doors open, light spilling softly into the night. And Marmalade, no longer stray, not entirely tame but wholly present, shifted closer, settling into the familiar space between now and next, as the season continued its slow, patient unfolding. Spring grew bolder after that, though it never became loud. It crept forward in increments so small they could only be noticed by someone paying close attention. Marmalade was very good at this kind of noticing. He felt it in the warmth of the porch boards beneath his paws, in the way the sun lingered longer on his back before drifting away. He felt it in the changing texture of the air, no longer damp and tentative, but curious, carrying whispers of things not yet visible. One morning, he ventured farther than usual. The door stood open, just as it often did now, and the porch led into the clearing with its familiar uneven stones and soft patches of moss. Marmalade padded forward slowly, stopping often to sit and look around, as though checking in with the world to be sure it remembered him. The apple tree had begun to bud. Not fully, not yet, but small, tight knots dotted the ends of its branches, promising more than they revealed. Marmalade sat beneath it, head tilted, studying the way light caught on those fragile beginnings. A bee passed by, slow and unhurried. Marmalade followed it with his eyes only. Behind him, Lara watched from the doorway, careful not to interrupt. She had learned when to move and when to remain exactly where she was. Some moments, she understood, needed room. When Marmalade eventually turned back, tail high and steps confident, she smiled in a way that held both pride and relief. "I knew you would," she said, though she hadn't known at all. The days filled themselves. There were small chores now, mending the fence, airing out blankets, washing windows clouded by winter's long breath. Lara worked with sleeves rolled up, movements loose and sure. Marmalade followed her progress like a slow-moving shadow, offering commentary in the form of trills and pointed stares. One afternoon, she carried a basket into the woods. "Just for a little while," she told him. Marmalade followed until the path narrowed and the forest thickened. The ground smelled rich and alive, and sounds came from every direction. His body tensed, instincts humming, not with fear but with memory. He stopped. Lara noticed immediately. She knelt and rested a hand against his chest, feeling his breath beneath her palm. "You can wait here," she said. "I'll come back." She left the basket beside him and disappeared between the trees. Marmalade sat very still. The forest shifted around him. A bird darted past. Leaves rustled. Something unseen moved deeper in the undergrowth. He stayed where he was, heart steady, ears alert, trusting, not the forest exactly but the path behind him. When Lara returned, basket fuller than before, he rose to meet her. "That was brave," she said softly. He did not know whether she meant staying or waiting, but he accepted the praise all the same. That evening, Lara cooked with the windows wide open. The smells of herbs and warm bread drifted freely into the dusk. Marmalade sat on the counter, watching her hands move, memorizing the familiar choreography. The letter came out again. This time, Lara unfolded it. Marmalade watched her face carefully. Her eyes moved across the page, then paused. Her mouth pressed into a thin line, not unhappy but thoughtful. She read it through once, then again, slower. She did not speak. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it beside her plate. Marmalade hopped down and brushed against her leg, anchoring her to the room, to the smell of food, to the sound of evening settling in. She rested her hand on his head and exhaled. "Not yet," she said, this time to the letter itself. Night gathered gently. The forest sang its layered songs, frogs and insects and distant wings weaving sound into something alive and comforting. Marmalade lay stretched on the rug, eyes half open, listening. Lara sat nearby, mending a tear he suspected she had left unmended on purpose until now. The cottage felt larger somehow, not emptier, but more open, as if its walls had learned how to hold space without closing in. As the firelight flickered low and the evening deepened, Marmalade rose and walked the length of the room, checking corners, doorways, windows. Everything was as it should be. He returned to his place beside Lara and curled in, the familiar weight of rest settling over him. Outside, spring continued its patient work, buds swelling, soil warming, paths softening underfoot. Inside, the cottage held its quiet rhythm, steady and unfinished. And Marmalade, who had once lived only between moments, now rested fully within them, unaware that the season ahead still had gentle surprises waiting, unfolding slowly, as all the best things did. Spring arrived the way Marmalade had learned it would, not with fanfare, not with certainty, but with trust. It came one morning when the apple tree bloomed all at once, pale petals opening like a held breath finally released. The clearing filled with a softness that felt earned, the kind that only follows patience. Sunlight poured through branches no longer bare, and the air hummed with life fully awake. Marmalade stood beneath the tree, petals drifting down to land on his fur. He shook once, indignant, then sat again, letting them settle where they pleased. The ground was warm now, truly warm. The earth no longer smelled like waiting. Behind him, the cottage door stood open wide. Lara came out carrying 2 mugs, steam curling upward in the mild air. She paused when she saw Marmalade beneath the blossoms, framed by light and falling white. "Oh," she said softly, "there you are." She set the mugs down on the porch and joined him, lowering herself to the grass without hesitation. They sat together, not touching but close enough that their shadows overlapped. Marmalade flicked his tail, brushing her knee. She smiled and rested her hand on the ground, palm down, letting the warmth rise into her. "I read the letter again last night," she said. Marmalade looked up at her. "It asked me to come back," she continued, "to pick up where I left off, to explain why I disappeared." She laughed quietly, not bitterly, not sadly, but honestly, as if I could explain it at all. Marmalade stood and stepped into her lap, settling there with the absolute certainty of someone who had made his choice long ago. Lara's breath caught, then steadied. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into the soft space between his ears. "I think," she said into his fur, "that this is where I stayed." The letter was folded carefully that afternoon and placed in the fire. Lara watched as it caught, curled, and vanished into ash, its words released back into warmth and light. Marmalade sat nearby, unbothered, basking in the sun that streamed through the open window. Later, she brought out the collar. It was cleaned now, the leather softened with oil, the small tag newly engraved. She knelt before Marmalade, letting him sniff it, examine it, decide. He touched it once with his paw, then sat very still. Lara fastened it gently. It fit as though it had always been meant for him. They moved through the days that followed with a shared ease that felt almost timeless. Lara planted the last of the seeds. Marmalade supervised from the shade, occasionally chasing a butterfly with half-hearted enthusiasm before flopping dramatically onto the grass. The cottage filled with green. The windows stayed open. The fire was forgotten. At night, the forest sang louder now, but it no longer felt like a call away. It felt like a conversation that could be joined or ignored, either choice equally safe. One evening, as the sky turned gold and then deepened into blue, Marmalade lay stretched across the threshold, half in, half out, exactly where he liked to be. Lara sat on the porch steps, bare feet in the grass, watching the light fade. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marmalade lifted his head. "For finding me," she added, "and for staying." He rose and walked inside, not quickly, not urgently, then turned back and sat just beyond the doorway. He looked at her, tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes calm and certain. Lara laughed softly. "All right," she said, "I see." When night finally settled, Marmalade slept curled on the bed, not by the door, not by the fire, but exactly where the moonlight fell. Lara lay beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of a life no longer braced for loss. Outside, the world continued, seasons turning, paths opening and closing, stories beginning elsewhere. But inside the cottage, something had completed itself. Marmalade had not been rescued. He had arrived. And Lara had not been found. She had been chosen. The cottage, quiet and full, held them both as it always had, doors open, hearth cold, windows bright, while the night wrapped gently around its walls, and the world at last felt like home.